Welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall. I want to get the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war, and you're taking a live look at the White House. Of course, there's a lot of decision-making being done. I want to talk about NATO, because NATO members Romania and Latvia on Sunday said that Russian military drones targeting infrastructure in neighboring Ukraine had violated NATO airspace, according to the Voice of America. The VOA says last month, another NATO member, Poland, also reported a possible fly-in of a Russian drone into its airspace during a large-scale Moscow-led air attack on Ukraine, but then they later backed off the claim. Retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer standing by. And how dangerous is it for Russia to be messing around in NATO air like this?
Well, Austin, it's very dangerous. I mean, you're violating their sovereign airspace, and of course, they're violating it with weapons of war. And they have the ability with radar to track these things, so it's not a mystery as to what they are or where they came from. It's really not even a mystery of who controls them, so to speak. And this has been an ongoing problem. Now, if you go down to Romania, which is on the Black Sea, the problem they've had there for quite some time is they would fire these drone attacks, and many times they'd overshoot Ukraine, and they have actually gotten the remnants of drones that have crashed in Romania. So it's not at first the Romanians were very reluctant to talk much about it because technically it's a if you want to push it, it's a Russian weapon of war that is now made an incursion into the sovereign space of a NATO country. Everyone's a little bit more open about discussing this more. So Romania was one of the first, but then there were also problems up north. Poland was talking about problems with missiles and drones. And of course, the Baltic states, you got Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia up there. Estonia doesn't really have a problem with drones, but when you get further south, there are some issues. And of course, remember, part of Russia is called Kaliningrad, which literally sits separate from Russia on the Baltic. So they're even to fly anything in and out of Kaliningrad, you have to go through NATO airspace. So this has been an ongoing problem with this. The thing about the and I think the Polish latest incursion is the one that really set them off. Some of these things as they fly right through, like a corner of a NATO country. They'll fly through. They're not in that airspace for long, and then they move right through. And it's a kind of an Occam's razor issue, dealing with how the drone is going. The problem with the Polish airspace incursion was it looks like the drone went in and literally just kind of spun circles for about 30 minutes and was spying on them. And what the Poles have brought out, and of course the Latvians and others are pointing out, is it looks like the Russians are literally testing NATO. They're sending these things intentionally in there to watch for the NATO reaction, to basically incrementally incur onto NATO airspace. And that's why you have this discussion that you have now, which is, that they ought to have a policy of just shooting them down.
Is this a newer feature of this war, Russia invading NATO airspace?
Well, it's not a brand new feature. Up north, it's a little newer feature. It hasn't happened as much. Down south, down in Romania, it's been happening for quite some time. But to give you an idea of the scope of the discussion, it's not just shooting. It's not just shooting or taking basically using air defense against these drones and missiles. I should mention they've had missile issues as well. In fact, a Russian missile actually landed in Poland some time back. So that gives you an idea of the danger there. But not just that, but Poland is actually talking about building a buffer zone. They're saying, look, these missiles and drones, they're coming our direction. We need standoff. And they could coordinate with the neighboring country, Ukraine, and they're talking about building an air defense buffer zone over Ukrainian airspace, going as far into Ukraine. And the last thing I saw was they were looking at Lviv, that larger western city, that big city where they just had a recent attack, extending it out that far. What that does is a number of things. First off, it allows NATO air defense weapons to cover Ukrainian airspace, all right, which is a big step if you're looking at where the war has been going. The other thing, too, is it allows the Ukrainians potentially to reallocate some of their organic air defense asset, like those Patriot missile batteries, and move them away from that western area where they're having to cover big cities like Lviv, and move them to other areas where they're more urgently needed further to the east. That's a very interesting possibility that could really change the air defense picture, if you will, within Ukraine. So these are some of the discussions that are happening. And of course, these are all happening at the same time that they're having discussions about changing the policy in terms of using other Western supplied weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah, you know,
So
Hal, I want
it
to
is a
ask you
big
about
jump.
that. That's actually something I wanted to bring up because the New York Times just published an article on that exact thing. They say Biden appears to be on the verge of clearing the way for Ukraine to launch long-range Western weapons deep inside Russian territory, as long as it doesn't use arms provided by the United States. That's according to European officials talking to the Times. British weapons would likely be used instead of U.S. weapons. The Times says the issue will come to a head on Friday with the first visit to the White House by Britain's new Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Hal, why would Britain be okay with this, but the U.S. not?
Well, it's interesting. It's not the first time. We've seen this in this war where Britain leads and then the U.S. follows. It's a very strange thing. You may remember that was the issue with the tanks. Britain proffered up chieftains before the U.S. proffered up our own Abrams tanks, and frankly, other countries started proffering up their tanks first. In this particular case, they have had Ukraine has had, I should say, the Storm Shadow missiles. They also have the French equivalent called Scalp, which is essentially the same missile. It's got a lot of range. It can go about 155 miles. It's a cruise missile. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop. It carries a very sizable warhead, and it really has it can make pardon the expression, a big impression, if you will, on whatever it hits. That would be a big change. Now we have provided ATACMS missiles, which is a long-range Army tactical missile that can fire well in like 100, almost 200, 195 kilometers or whatever. It goes well into wherever they're going. It's got a lot of range on it. Can carry a very large warhead, and they've been using those shorter range ones to great effect. But the discussion is, should these Western weapons be allowed to hit further in, particularly looking at airfields, looking at ammunition dumps, looking at places where they launch drones and launch missiles from. That's what the Ukrainians say. Look, if we could push them back a couple hundred miles, if we can make them, it'll slow down, it'll limit their ability to launch these weapons, whether drones or missiles. And certainly looking at these Russian glide bombs that they've been dropping from aircraft, if we can slow down their sortie rate, their ability to turn around aircraft because their airfields are much further out, then that will slow down or hinder their ability to launch these weapons. That's what this means. Keir Starmer is in Washington, D.C. as we speak. He is meeting with President Biden tomorrow. There has been speculation that they may jointly change the policy tomorrow. But there was also some language saying that they're looking for a UN National Security Council meeting that was scheduled in a couple weeks, and that maybe they'll wait and see and maybe drag their feet a couple weeks. It is really not clear, although Keir Starmer, when he got into Washington, D.C., made some language which sounded like that Britain, if not the U.S. joining with them, that Britain was going to shift their policy sooner rather than later. And so we might see that. And once that policy shift is changed, it could be that the U.S., which seems to be a little more reticent on making these big policy changes, will see what happens. Watch what the Russians do. And depending on that reaction, the U.S. may follow suit and then change its own policy. But it is very odd. It's been a big discussion, which is who's pulling back more on this. And it seems that the U.S. is, and within the U.S. bureaucracy, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, seems to be leaning forward on this. But the Pentagon and some of the intelligence community have been saying, whoa, hold on. We're not quite sure what the Russian reaction is going to be. So let's take a little bit slower shift on this. The Brits, on the other hand, they seem to have little less reticence to make these changes and implement these new policy initiatives. So that may be the way it rolls out.
Yeah, hasn't the whole point of Ukraine's military operations been a defensive effort? Hasn't that been the whole point of all of this? Doesn't an offensive, and I know they've already been on the offensive, but changing policy and perhaps doubling down on the offensive aspect of this, doesn't that bring the possibility of further escalation?
That's exactly what is being said in the Pentagon. Their fear is We've already allowed them to use some limited weapons closer into the border as a defensive action. That was mostly dealing with that issue around up in Kharkiv Oblast. If you recall, some months back, where the Russians earlier this year went into Kharkiv Oblast and started to open up that northern salient, if you will. They didn't get very far, but they did do that. And the Ukrainians said, look, our hands are tied. Their artillery is over the border. Their logistics are over the border. They got all this stuff sitting right over the border, and we can't use these Western supplied weapons on the other side of the border. That was where you saw the first change saying, okay, go ahead. You can use these weapons for very tactical purposes just over the border with these, limitations on how it's supposed to be used. This would be pushing them back more. If I was to speculate on what the U.S. policy will be, I think they're going to limit it as to the types of targets. They may limit it as to the geography, and some of that geography literally could be limited by the range of the weapon itself. But I think that's what you'll probably see is they'll say, okay, you can use it against those things that are directly supporting the war effort in Ukraine, and that would open up a whole slew of targets. I have to tell you, there's not an unlimited supply of long range ATACMS or Scalp or Storm Shadow missiles. Period. So as we like to say, there'd be lots of things to do from a targeting perspective, and you'd have to figure out what is your priority for targeting. So that would probably be a sufficient change, and then they'll see what is the Russian reaction. The fear is, and this has been a fear that goes back really almost to the beginning months of the war, is that there would be something that hits an escalation point, and the Russians want to use a tactical nuclear weapon, either in a direct action or some sort of demonstration. There's even been talk that they might do a demonstration on Russian territory near the border, as opposed to actually hitting in Ukraine with a Russian nuclear weapon. That is the big fear, that as we do more things where there's U.S. and Western NATO involvement, in this case, using our weapons to attack Russian territory, that at some point, a very embattled, if you will, very, at least politically defensive Putin might decide to lash out with a rather rash, poorly considered decision to do something in the nuclear realm. That's the big escalation fear. So far, all we've seen with the Russians and Putin certainly have been every few days, there must be something on the calendar says rattle the nuclear saber. And somebody comes out and threatens to use nuclear weapons if you do this. Oh, if you do this, we're going to look at nuclear weapons. Oh, there'll be a serious escalation. That's been the rhetorical flourish coming out of Moscow continuously on this. So at some point, we started to become a little bit almost immune to some of these rhetorical attacks, if you will, coming from Moscow. But with that said, there are those analysts that look at this, on defense intelligence side, certainly with CIA and other intelligence agencies, that go, well, we got to be careful. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it can't happen. So they're the ones that are kind of pulling back on these big policy changes because they're looking at some other things that on the overt, if you will, the open source side of this world that we may not see, they may see. They may see things happening that are hidden to us, where they go, there's a reason why we need to be a little more careful about this, because this is what they did.
Major developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. Hal, as always, thanks. Have a good night.